Xaku has always been a very powerful warframe, but more of a glass cannon. Well, not anymore, because today I'm gonna show you how to build your Xaku to not only dish out tons of damage that scales perfectly well into even level cap, but also how to be completely untouchable at the same time. So, after a huge shout out to all generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on, let's jump right into it. First off, let's talk about Xaku's skill, starting out with their passive. Xaku's passive is really interesting, and I think a lot of people misunderstand what it actually means. What it does is, it gives Xaku a 25% dodge chance when taking a bullet, as well as a 25% damage reduction on area of effect damage. Now, what this dodge chance actually means is that if your Warframe gets hit, like if you would take damage, a dice is being rolled, and then in this case, there's a 25% chance that you actually don't get hit. This applies to direct hits through projectiles and melee attacks, but not to AoE damage like explosions. Xaku's first ability is called Xata's Whisper, and this one is a pretty popular one because this is also Xaku's helmet ability, meaning you can put it onto any other frame you like. What Xata's Whisper does is it infuses your weapons with void damage, and the special thing about this is that this is the only way in the entire game that a Warframe can actually deal void damage, because usually this damage type is only reserved to operator amps. Now, when it comes to what void damage actually is and what its properties are, what it does, I recently made a video on all the damage types in Warframe, explaining also this one in detail, but for the sake of this video, let's go over it again real quick. Void damage doesn't have any damage bonuses or malices against most enemy types, and the status effect creates a little bubble around the enemy that attracts incoming fire, kinda like Mag's Magnetize Bubble. Definitely a nice skill, however, for today's build, we're not gonna use it at all, so I'm gonna keep it short here. Ability number 2 is Xaku's bread and butter, and the reason why they are so incredibly strong. This ability is called Grasp of Lohk. Now, what this one does is, it steals nearby enemies' weapons and lets them float next to you, shooting those enemies. So essentially, you get a ton of free auto turrets dealing damage to surrounding enemies. These turrets deal void damage, meaning you don't have to worry that much about damage bonuses or malices. They work pretty much exactly the same against any type of enemy you're gonna encounter. However, they cannot deal status effects, so don't cheer too early about all the nice bubbles you're gonna get, because unfortunately, you won't. The reason why this one is so good is that the damage output of these weapons is depending on the enemy level that you stole the weapons from. Meaning, if you steal a weapon from a level 1 enemy, you're naturally going to deal way less damage than stealing it from a level 100 enemy. And that is precisely the reason why Xaku scaled so well into even the highest levels, because your damage output through these weapons is always going to be proportional to the enemy level you're fighting. One very important last thing to mention here is that the damage bonus from your first ability unfortunately does not apply to these weapons, so they don't get buffed from Xata's Whisper. And Grasp of Lohk also has an augment called Vampiric Grasp, where you heal yourself whenever you deal damage with these weapons to enemies that are affected by your fourth ability. All in all, if you wanted to play Xaku into a sort of health tank kind of playstyle, this would be helpful. However, if you ask me, then Xaku is not meant to be played like that, and if you really need constant healing for your Xaku, you're probably doing something wrong, so for today, this one right here is a no-no. Xaku's skill number 3, the Lost. This one is one of these glorious abilities where you actually have 3 abilities in one that you can cycle through. For some reason, you cannot see this in the simulacrum, which is really weird, seems to be a bug. But for today's build, it's actually not all that important. Let me tell you what I mean. This one has 3 different skills. One of them is used to deal void damage to enemies in front of you and also elevate them into the air. If you ask me, not really special or useful at all. You have another one which kind of works like Enthrall from Revenant, where you turn the enemies against themselves and make them your allies for some time. But also here, if you ask me, this one is not only pretty useless, but actually counterproductive to what we want to go for, because your auto turrets from your second skill do not attack enemies that you have turned into allies with this skill, meaning you're gonna have a ton of enemies running behind you as your allies, and once the duration ends, they're gonna turn into enemies again, and your turrets are not gonna do anything against them. So yeah, with your third skill, the actually only useful version of this would be called Gaze, where you stun one enemy, that then creates an AoE around that enemy, and in that AoE, every enemy is going to be armor and shield stripped at the same time. This is a great and very useful way of reducing enemy defenses, so if you ask me, the whole complexity of Xaku's third skill with all the 3 different sub-abilities, what it boils down to is, this is an armor strip and we're only going to use it for that. This one also has an augment which gives you more ability strength and efficiency when casting, but if you ask me, this is kind of a bit clunky and we better just mod for ability duration with our normal mods, and that's going to be fine. And finally, Xaku's ultimate, the Vast Untime. This one explodes your body parts outwards, hitting enemies, making them A, slower, and B, 50% more vulnerable to void damage. That already is pretty good, but what it also does is, remember the dodge chance of 25% that we have, when we get hit to actually not get hit? Well, for as long as the 4th ability is on, this is increased up to a whopping 75%, so whenever you take a hit, you have a 75% chance to not get hit at all. This is super cool, and with many builds out there, this is the main source of Xaku's survivability so that they're not getting hit in the first place. One other great feature of this is that as long as this ability is on, the ability durations of all your other active abilities are frozen. Meaning as long as you are in your skeleton form right here, the timers of your other abilities stop ticking down, effectively giving them pretty much an infinite uptime if you want to. That's great, and it means that we don't have to worry about ability duration all that much. What I do worry about though are likes, because they help big time with the YouTube algorithm, so if you could spare one, that would be super duper amazing and a huge help for the channel. So cheers so much for your support. But now, let's go on with the rest of the video. Now, I am fully aware that with Xaku's skills I simplified a bit here and there because not all the interactions that their skills have matter for today's build. But just to make clear what exactly we're going to go for, let me quickly for 1 minute explain to you how Xaku is actually meant to be played. First off, when you're in the mission, you want to have your 4th skill on all the time. A, to freeze the countdown of your other abilities, but also because of that massive 75% dodge chance, so you're much more survivable. Then, as soon as you're in the middle of a lot of enemies, steal their weapons to fire back, and whenever you feel that the enemy is a bit too resistant, then use the defense reduction from your 3rd ability to make them more vulnerable. As you also see here in the background, they go down in a split second. If you wanted to also use your weapons, then you could use Xata's Whisper to infuse them with void damage, certainly doesn't hurt, but with today's build, we're not going to use that, and that's why today, the first is going to be our Helmet slot. But alright, now that you know what Xaku can do and how they're meant to be played, how about we finally take a look at the build, as always starting out with the Archon shards, because without understanding what I went for here, you won't understand why the build works this way. For the Archon shards, I first went for 3 blues, giving me a total of plus 150 maximum energy. This is so I don't have to use a flow mod, effectively opening up 1 mod slot for the build. Then, the other 2, in my opinion, are pretty much up to personal preference. However, I went for more ability strength to give my auto-firing void weapons a little bit more oomph, but if you wanted to go for something else, I could also recommend more casting speed, because this is going to come in handy too. As for Xaku's build itself, what we want to go for is as much range as we possibly can. The reason for that is not only to increase the radius of the armor strip from your 3rd ability, but also the fact that your 2nd ability, the auto turrets, scale incredibly well with more ability range, not only as to how far they can shoot at enemies, but also the higher your range is, the more of these weapons you can steal from enemies. So naturally, you want to have as much range as you possibly can, which is why I went for stretch, augur reach, and overextended. But if we want to deal damage and fully armor strip all the enemies around us, we also need a little bit of ability strength. That's why beyond the Archon shards, I went for growing power in the aura, blind rage, transient fortitude, augur secrets, and mold augmented in the arcane slot to give us a lot of damage for those weapons, and also to ensure that we're always going to full strip all the enemies around us. Then Streamline to offset the efficiency cost of Blind Rage, and Prime Continuity to get a little bit more duration, but we don't need that much actually. To make sure that our energy needs are met, I went for Arcane Energize, but if you don't have that, you can of course always also go and replace one of these mods with Equilibrium, is going to be working out fine. And finally, because Xaku is still pretty squishy, Prime Sure-Footed to make sure we're not going to get knocked down because because with Xaku, knockdowns are actually really deadly. This right here would be the full build, but before we go on, I also want to take a minute to talk about the helmet options for Xaku because there are actually quite a few. If you personally don't like the armor stripping mechanics of their third ability, then my go-to would be replacing the 3 with Necros' Terrify, because not only is that a more convenient AoE armor, but also it scares the enemies around you, making it so that they don't attack you, which gives you a noticeable amount of more survivability. Then, of course, when it comes to energy, you could always go for the standard energy skills, Fractured Blast from Citrine, or maybe Nourish from Grendel, always works out nicely, as well as Roar for more damage, or the defensive version of Mirage's Eclipse if you wanted to play your Xaku more into a shield tanking type of playstyle. All of this works really great, however, for today's build, I didn't use any of these skills, I went for Weird Scythes from Daggeth. Why did I do that? Well, because we're gonna go for a very, very cheeky and, if you ask me, pretty broken approach of survivability in this one, and that is exactly what I want to talk about now. Remember how I said that Xaku's main source of survivability is the 75% dodge chance from your 4? Well, if you're playing Xaku conventionally, then this is the case, which is why you're gonna have to focus immensely onto shield gating and always casting your abilities, making sure that your shield doesn't stay at 0, and if you then take another hit, you would be instantly dead and all that type of stuff because Xaku is so squishy. And let me just say, the traditional playstyle of Xaku shield gating does work, but it is very stressful and you gotta make sure to not run out of energy. However, when testing for this build, I rediscovered something that I've talked about a long time ago. See, when you're using Shade as a companion, or I think the Huras Kubra it was, they can make you and themselves invisible whenever you're close to an enemy. Now, in the past, this one wasn't really anything to write home about because there were some weird line of sight issues going on, and we all know that Warframe and line of sight had a troublesome relationship in the past. However, with the Dante nerf that also brought a rework of how line of sight works in Warframe, this has massively changed for the better, making invisibility through Shade now an actually very viable tactic for survivability. Let me explain what I mean here. Shade has a mod called Ghost. This one makes it that whenever an enemy is within 24 meters of you, so that's a pretty good range, you and Shade become invisible, and you will stay invisible as long as there is an enemy within 24 meters of you. If you're playing a standard Steel Path mission, then this requirement is pretty much always going to be met, so you can stay constantly invisible. This one, unfortunately, has a downside though, and that is, as soon as you start attacking the enemies with your weapons, your invisibility is instantly gonna be over. However, this only applies if you attack enemies with weapons. If you deal damage to them with skills, you can still stay invisible as long as you please. I think you know what I'm going for here. When you bring Shade into the mission, with the Ghost mod, Shade will make you invisible, and because all the damage that you're going to be dealing to the enemies come from your second ability, your auto turrets, this counts as ability damage, meaning this does not cancel your invisibility. This is, by the way, also why I went for Weird Scythes as Helmet's ability, because with this, we can apply tons of viral to all the enemies around us, also without being uncloaked, because it too is an ability. If we would have gone for a Kuvanukor or any type of other primer weapon, then this would have cancelled our invisibility, so we cannot do that. So yeah, with this build you can not only shield and armor strip all the enemies around you, and deal tons of scaling damage to them, but also your Shade is pretty much going to keep you invisible all the time, and your invisibility doesn't get cancelled because we're not going to use our weapons at all. This right here would be my Shade build. Most of this is actually not too important. The only things that really matter would be Ghost, of course, to make yourself invisible, but also Guardian for the emergency case where you might take a hit to your shield, so your shields get instantly refilled and everything is fine. Duplex Bond, because you can actually equip that to your Shade, and while your main Shade and you are gonna stay invisible, Shade's duplicates from Duplex Bond won't be, and they can attack enemies while your invisibility is still gonna be intact, which would combine great with, for example, a Verglass to freeze everybody around us, or as I did here, with a Hellstrom to apply even more status through explosions to all the enemies around us, serving as sort of an indirect primer. If you like, then feel free to experiment around a little bit with this yourself. But before we wrap up the video for today, let's also take a quick look at a more budget-friendly approach to this build, which is still going to be very potent. First off, in the aura you can use whatever you like. I just swapped in Dreamer's Bond as a placeholder. Again, a lot of range with Stretch, Augur Reach, and Overextended. Ability Strength is going to come from Umbral Intensify, Transient Fortitude, and Augur Secrets, and then Continuity to give us that little bit more duration, with Equilibrium filling the last mod slot, of course to make sure that our energy economy is going to be spot on. This right here would be the full build, and if you pair it with that Shade tactic, then you're also going to deal tons of damage scaling with enemy level, and it doesn't feel all too inferior to the more expensive Steel Path build. And if you now want to know everything about Warframe's current meta, what's the best and what you should use, then don't miss this guide right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtle Pier, Pepper Wolf, Ondakanio2, Streamjet21, Signup King 5000, Griblib Yixi, Mihawk HE, Yagis, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot!